Winter, 1462. Paris, the dungeons of the Châtelet. The air itself is a physical weight, a thick, cold brine saturated with the smells of stale urine, damp stone, and the quiet, metallic scent of despair that clings to places where men wait to die. The darkness is not merely an absence of light, it is a living entity, broken only by the faint, greasy glimmer of a torch from a distant corridor, a light that seems to mock the very concept of hope. The only sounds are the slow drip of water oozing through ancient mortar and the soft, maddening scuttling of rats, the true lords of this subterranean kingdom. A man sits huddled in the filth, the cold of the iron shackle on his ankle, a familiar numbing ache that has seeped into his very bones. This is François Villon, aged 31, though his face, gaunt and etched with the bitter lines of hunger and fear, could belong to a man of 50. He is a master of arts from the Sorbonne and a convicted thief. The hollow echo of footsteps approaches, deliberate and heavy, the sound of finality, the groan of a rusted lock, the squeal of hinges, and a sliver of the outside world's foul air invades the cell. A clerk, his face impassive, a mask of bureaucratic indifference, unrolls a parchment. The words he reads are not shouted, but spoken in a flat, dispassionate tone that makes them all the more terrible, a simple recitation of fact. He speaks of brawls, of robberies, of a life lived outside the grace of God and the king. And then comes the verdict, the culmination of it all. For his crimes, François Villon is to be taken to the gallows of Montfaucon, there to be hanged and strangled. In that moment, the world for Villon shrinks to a single, horrifying image. The towering gibbet, its arms silhouetted against a gray sky, adorned with the blackened, bird-pecked remains of other men who ran out of luck. He can almost feel the rough hemp on his neck, the sickening drop, the final, frantic explosion of darkness. This is the absolute nadir, the end of a life squandered in taverns and back alleys. And yet, in this very moment of utter annihilation, something extraordinary is happening. In the taverns above, students are reciting his verses. In the courts of nobles, his ballads are being copied and passed around. The man is condemned, but the poet is already becoming immortal. This is the saga of him, François Villon, the patron saint of damned poets, the scholar who haunted the criminal underworld of 15th century Paris. This is the narrative of a man who wrote his most enduring works under the shadow of the gallows, a genius who bequeathed a treasure of immortal verse to the very society that sought to hang him. The central dramatic paradox of his existence, the question that echoes through more than 5 centuries, is how? How did this rogue, this brawler, this unrepentant thief manage to capture the very soul of France in his poetry? How did a man who lived a life of utter degradation, who knew the squalor of the prison cell and the sharp terror of the torturer's tools, become the first truly modern poet, a voice so raw, so honest, and so profoundly human that it resonates even today? This was not a poet who wrote of chivalric love in manicured gardens. He wrote of rotting corpses swinging on the gibbet, of the pock-marked faces of prostitutes, of the gnawing hunger in his own belly, and of the bitter, defiant laughter of a man who has nothing left to lose. His life was a frantic dance with death, and his poetry was the breathtaking, desperate music that accompanied it. To answer the core question of his transformation from criminal to cultural icon, we cannot simply analyze his texts. We must descend with him into the frozen, muddy streets of his Paris, a city that was both his stage and his personal hell. We must feel the chill of the dungeon, hear the jeers of the crowd, and understand the profound, spiritual alchemy that allowed him to transmute his immense suffering into timeless beauty. The story of François Villon is the story of how the gutter can, on rare and miraculous occasions, produce a star that outshines the constellations of kings and nobles, proving that the most authentic voice of a nation is often found not in its palaces, but in its prisons. To understand this man, we must return to the world of his birth, a France staggering to its feet at the tail end of the 100 Years' War. The year is 1431. The same year, the English would burn Joan of Arc at the stake in Rouen. The kingdom is a scarred, broken thing, a patchwork quilt of devastation held together by the tenuous threads of a Valois monarchy. The English still hold Paris, a city that has become a brutalized, half-starved shadow of its former self. Chroniclers of the time write of a city in a state of near collapse, where packs of wolves would slip through breaches in the walls at night to feast on the corpses left in overflowing cemeteries. This was not a world of romance and chivalry. It was a landscape of raw survival, defined by the gnawing realities of plague, famine, and the casual cruelty of incessant warfare. The great schism of the Church had fractured the spiritual certainty of Christendom, and the old feudal order was cracking under the strain. Into this crucible of chaos, a new kind of power was emerging, embodied by King Louis XI, who would later be known as the Universal Spider. He was a monarch who preferred the intricate webs of espionage, bribery, and political assassination to the open field of battle, a cold, pragmatic ruler for a cold, pragmatic age. It was a society of violent extremes. Immense piety existed alongside savage brutality, opulent wealth next to abject poverty, and the lofty ideals of the university alongside the grim reality of the public executioner. The gallows at Montfaucon, a monstrous stone structure with room for dozens of hanging bodies, was one of Paris's most prominent landmarks, a constant public reminder of the swift and brutal justice of the king. This was the macro-level chessboard on which Villon's life would be played out. A world where life was cheap, death was ever present, and salvation, whether spiritual or material, was a desperate, daily struggle. He was born into the bottom strata of this unforgiving world, a piece of human flotsam with no name or inheritance to shield him. His genius lay in his ability to absorb this world's harshness and reflect it back with an unblinking, sardonic honesty that no French poet had ever dared before. The story of the poet François Villon begins with the disappearance of the boy François de Montcorbier. Born in Paris to a poor woman of whom we know nothing, and a father who vanished from the record entirely, his destiny seemed to be one of utter obscurity, another nameless child swallowed by the vast, indifferent city. But fate, in one of its strange and merciful twists, intervened. The boy was taken in, adopted by a man named Guillaume de Villon, a respected and kind-hearted chaplain at the Church of Saint-Benoît-le-Bétourné, a stone's throw from the bustling, chaotic world of the Sorbonne. This single act of charity was the hinge upon which his entire life would turn. It gave him not just a home and a name, but a future. Guillaume was more than a guardian. He was, in Villon's own words, his more than father, a man who provided him with the most valuable gift possible in that rigidly structured world: an education. Young François was enrolled in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Paris, that great intellectual heart of medieval Europe. Here, in the Latin Quarter, he was immersed in a world of theology, rhetoric, and classical learning. He read the masters, debated in Latin, and earned his bachelor's and then his Master of Arts degrees by 1,452. On paper, he was a success story, a boy from nowhere who had become a scholar, a clerk with a respectable path laid out before him. But this very education created the central, agonizing conflict of his soul. While his mind was being filled with Aristotle and Aquinas, his spirit remained tethered to the streets. He was a creature of two worlds, fluent in both the language of the lecture hall and the slang of the back alley cutthroats. This duality forged his unique character. The razor-sharp intellect of a scholar, combined with the cunning, cynicism, and desperate survival instincts of a street dog. He could compose a perfect, elegant ballad, and then, in the very next stanza, use the crude, vibrant jargon of the Parisian underworld. This internal war between the clerk and the criminal, the poet and the pauper, would fuel his creative genius while simultaneously ensuring his worldly ruin. He was forever an outsider, too learned for the thieves and too coarse for the scholars, a man perpetually at odds with himself and the world. The first irrevocable step from the world of scholarly promise into the abyss of crime and exile was taken on a hot and humid evening, the 5th of June, 1455. It was the feast of Corpus Christi, and the streets of Paris were filled with a volatile mix of religious fervor and drunken revelry. Near the church of Saint-Benoît, in the Rue Saint-Jacques, François Villon was sitting on a stone bench with a priest named Gilles and a woman named Isabeau. What began as a typical evening of wine and conversation swiftly spiraled into violence. A confrontation erupted with another priest, a certain Philippe Serment, likely over the woman. Tempers flared, insults were exchanged, and daggers were drawn. In the ensuing scuffle, Serment struck Villon in the lip with a dagger, drawing blood. Villon, in a blaze of fury, retaliated. He stabbed Serment in the groin with his own blade, and then, as the priest lay wounded, Villon's companion, Gilles, smashed his skull with a heavy stone. Serment died the next day. This was not a calculated act of malice, but a common, sordid street brawl, the kind that ended lives every night in the violent melting pot of Paris. But for Villon, it was the point of no return. He was now a wanted man, a murderer. He fled the city immediately, becoming a fugitive from the king's justice. While he would later receive 2 separate royal pardons for the killing, arguing, quite plausibly, that it was an act of self-defense, the event fundamentally altered the trajectory of his life. The psychological seal had been broken. He had crossed the line from being a rowdy student to being a man who had taken a life. The experience of being an outlaw, of living on the run, of depending on his wits to survive outside the structured protection of the university, hardened him. It was his baptism into the great game of survival, a game played not in the courts of kings, but in the muddy roads and shadowy forests of a lawless France. This first taste of blood and exile would become a recurring pattern, a cycle of violence, flight, and fleeting pardon that would define the rest of his tortured existence and provide the raw, experiential material for his greatest poetry. Beneath the swagger of the brawler and the cunning of the thief lay Villon's true inner demon, the secret motivation that animated every line he ever wrote, a profound and terrifying obsession with the relentless passage of time and the horrifying finality of death. In an age where the average life expectancy was short and death was a public, everyday spectacle, Villon's fixation was nonetheless extraordinary. He was not merely aware of death, he was intimate with it. He saw it everywhere, in the faded beauty of the women he had once desired, in the skulls of the anonymous dead in the cemetery of the innocents, and most vividly in the blackened, swaying bodies on the gallows of Montfaucon. This obsession was the engine of his poetry. His most famous ballad, the Ballad des Dames du temps jadis, with its haunting refrain, Mais où sont les neiges d'antan? But where are the snows of yesteryear? Is not just a wistful lament for bygone beauty. It is a howl of despair against the cosmic injustice of decay. He saw time as the ultimate thief, a force that steals beauty, youth, and life with ruthless indifference. This fear was intertwined with a burning rage against the hypocrisy of the powerful. He looked at the wealthy merchants, the corrupt clergymen, and the smug judges, and saw men who used their earthly power to insulate themselves from the harsh realities that he and his fellow paupers faced daily. Yet he knew that they too would succumb to the same worms, the same inevitable rot. This knowledge fueled his sardonic, biting wit. His poetry becomes a great equalizer, a democratic art form where popes, kings, and common prostitutes all end up as dust. This desperate quest to defy oblivion, to leave something behind that time could not erase, became his ultimate motivation. If he could not achieve immortality through piety or power, he would seize it through verse. He poured his entire being, his regrets, his sins, his loves, his hates, into his writing, creating a monument of words that he hoped would stand long after his own bones had been scattered and forgotten. The verses were his rebellion, his only weapon against the two forces he feared most, the silence of the grave and the indifference of eternity. Villon's life was a constant oscillation between two diametrically opposed worlds, and this duality is perfectly encapsulated by the fateful encounters that defined his path. On one end of the spectrum was the rarefied world of the high nobility, embodied by his encounter with Charles, Duke of Orléans. After his first exile from Paris, Villon the Wanderer found his way to the Duke's court at Blois. Charles was himself one of the finest courtly poets of the age, a prince who had spent 25 years as a captive in England after the Battle of Agincourt, honing his craft in gilded captivity. He represented a dying chivalric ideal, a world of elegant, stylized verse and refined sentiment. For a time, Villon found a patron in this prince-poet, participating in a poetry contest at his court, and enjoying a brief respite from his life of poverty and crime. This encounter was a validation of his talent, a glimpse into a life of stability and artistic recognition that he might have had. It proved that his genius was recognized even in the highest circles. Yet, Villon was constitutionally incapable of being a court poet. His voice was too raw, his spirit too rebellious. He could not, or would not, smooth the rough edges of his verse to suit the delicate sensibilities of the aristocracy. On the other end of the spectrum was his alliance with the Coquillards, a notorious and widespread criminal brotherhood. This was not a loose gang of petty thieves, but a highly organized secret society with its own leaders, its own rules, and its own secret language, or jargon, which Villon would masterfully incorporate into several of his ballades. For the Coquillards, crime was a profession. They were counterfeiters, pimps, burglars, and murderers. Villon's association with them, likely solidified during his periods of exile, plunged him deep into the criminal underworld. This was his other court, a dark fraternity of outcasts united by their shared rebellion against society. This alliance gave him protection, a sense of belonging, and the raw, dangerous subject matter for his most unique works. These two encounters, the prince and the gang, represent the warring poles of his existence. He was a man who could charm a duke with a perfectly crafted Ballad, and then conspire with a cutthroat to rob a church. This constant tension between the allure of the palace and the pull of the gutter is what makes him such a compelling and tragic figure. He was a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. The descent from a pardoned scholar into a professional criminal was solidified by an act of supreme audacity and greed. The robbery of the Collège de Navarre in Paris, around Christmas of 1456. This was no petty theft born of desperation. It was a carefully planned and executed heist that demonstrated a new level of criminal commitment. Along with 4 accomplices, Villon broke into the wealthy college's treasury. They gained access to a strong box containing some 500 gold crowns, an immense sum of money, enough to live comfortably for years. The crime was a direct affront to the university that had nurtured him, a symbolic act of biting the hand that had fed him. It represented his definitive choice to embrace the life of an outlaw. The price of power for Villon was not political influence, but the fleeting, dangerous freedom that a bag of gold could buy. With his share of the loot, he fled Paris once again, embarking on a 5-year period of wandering through the Loire Valley. This act fundamentally changed his status in the eyes of the law. He was no longer just a brawler involved in a manslaughter case for which he had been pardoned. He was now a master thief, a known member of a criminal conspiracy. The records of the investigation, which survived and were discovered centuries later, provide a detailed account of the crime and name Villon as one of the ringleaders. His name was now permanently inscribed in the ledgers of the Parisian authorities. This period of exile, funded by stolen gold, was also a period of intense poetic activity. He was living the life of a vagabond, moving from town to town, court to court, sometimes finding patronage, other times likely resorting to crime to survive. The memory of this grand theft and the consequences it brought would become a central theme in his later work, Le Grand Testament, where he wryly bequeaths his non-existent wealth and reflects on the transient nature of earthly riches. The robbery of the Collège de Navarre was the moment Villon fully committed to the path of the wolf, a path that offered the thrill of freedom but led inexorably toward the trap. The primary antagonist in the saga of François Villon was not a single person, not a rival poet or a scorned lover, but something far more vast and terrifying: the implacable, impersonal, and brutally efficient machine of 15th-century French justice. This was not a system concerned with rehabilitation or nuanced understanding. It was an instrument of state power designed to enforce social order through sheer terror. Its symbols were the ominous fortress of the Grand Châtelet in Paris, which served as the city's main court, police headquarters, and prison, and the monstrous public gallows at Montfaucon. The provost of Paris, a figure who combined the roles of police chief, prosecutor, and judge, held immense power over the lives of the city's inhabitants. Justice was swift, public, and savage. Torture was a standard and legally sanctioned part of any serious criminal investigation, used to extract confessions and the names of accomplices. The methods were horrific: the rack, the strappado, the application of burning fat or hot irons, and the water torture, where victims were forced to ingest enormous quantities of water. For Villon, this system was a constant, looming presence, the ultimate predator in the urban jungle he inhabited. He saw it not as a force for good, but as the ultimate hypocrisy, a system run by powerful men who were often more corrupt than the petty thieves they condemned, a tool used to protect the property of the rich and crush the spirits of the poor. He had a deep, personal familiarity with its workings. He had been in its dungeons. He had likely felt the sting of its instruments, and he had heard the flat tones of its clerks pronouncing sentences of death. His poetry is filled with a visceral hatred for this legal machine. He writes with chilling realism about prison life, the dunghill where no light can shine, and he directly taunts the judges and magistrates who hold his life in their hands. The law was his Moby Dick, the great white whale he could neither defeat nor escape. His entire life was a series of desperate maneuvers to elude its grasp, a frantic race that he was, by the very nature of the game, destined to lose. This constant grinding conflict with an all-powerful, merciless system is what gives his work its profound sense of urgency and its defiant, modern spirit of rebellion against overwhelming authority. The absolute lowest point of Villon's physical existence, the moment of his most profound degradation, became the catalyst for his greatest artistic transformation. This fatal mistake was not a single act, but the culmination of his criminal career, which led to his arrest and imprisonment in the summer of 1461. He found himself in the dungeons of Meung-sur-Loire, a fortress belonging to the powerful Bishop of Orléans, Thibault d'Aussigny. The conditions were unspeakably brutal. In his testament, Villon describes being chained in a pit, fed on bread and water, and subjected to torture. This was not just a legal proceeding, it was a systematic breaking of the man. Bishop d'Aussigny, a man Villon would come to despise with every fiber of his being, seemed determined to make an example of the troublesome poet-thief. It was during this long, dark period of suffering that Villon underwent a profound psychological shift. Stripped of everything, his freedom, his health, his dignity, he discovered the one thing his captors could not take from him: his inner world, his memory, and his voice. The physical breaking forged an unbreakable poetic will. He realized that true freedom was not about escaping the city watch or having gold in his purse. True freedom was the power of the mind to create, to remember, to mock, and to transcend its physical cage. The prison cell became his university, his monastery, his crucible. It was here, in the darkness of the bishop's dungeon, that the ideas, themes, and raw emotions that would form his masterpiece, Le Grand Testament, began to crystallize. He confronted his own mortality in the most direct way possible, and in doing so, he found his universal theme. He understood that by writing with unflinching honesty about his own sin-filled, suffering life, he was writing about the universal human condition. The experience in Meung-sur-Loire was his descent into hell, but it was from that hell that he would emerge with the voice of a prophet, a man who had seen the abyss and returned to tell the tale with a clarity and power he had never possessed before. The chains on his body freed his mind, and the cruelty of the bishop ironically provided the final, essential ingredient for his immortality. Chaos, in the brutal world of the 15th century, often came in the form of the king's whim, and it was from this very source that Villon's miraculous, if temporary, salvation would come. As the poet languished in the dungeons of Meung-sur-Loire, slowly starving and broken by torture, an event of great political significance was unfolding across the kingdom. In July of 1461, King Charles VII died, and his son, the calculating and ruthless Louis XIV, ascended to the throne. It was customary for a new monarch to make a royal progress through his kingdom shortly after his coronation, a tour designed to solidify his authority and receive the fealty of his powerful vassals. As part of this tradition, the king would often grant pardons and declare amnesties as a sign of his royal grace and magnanimity. On the 2nd of October, 1461, King Louis XIV made his formal entry into the town of Meung-sur-Loire. In accordance with custom, the town's prisoners were to be released as a tribute to the new king. François Villon, a half-dead, forgotten inmate in the bishop's private prison, was among them. His release was not the result of an appeal, nor was it a recognition of his poetic genius. It was a bureaucratic accident, a stroke of pure, blind luck. He was simply one of the anonymous wretches who benefited from a medieval custom. For Villon, a man who saw the hand of fate in every tavern brawl and every turn of the dice, this sudden, inexplicable freedom must have felt like a resurrection. He stumbled out of the darkness of the dungeon into the autumn sunlight, a skeletal figure, sick and destitute, but alive. He saw this not just as the king's mercy, but as a cosmic joke played upon his great enemy, Bishop Thibaut d'Aussigny, whose prize captive had been snatched away by a stroke of a pen. This experience, being brought to the brink of death and then yanked back by an accident of royal politics, profoundly shaped the tone of his subsequent work. It infused his writing with a sense of fatalism, a deep understanding of the absurdity of human affairs, and the sardonic humor of a man who had stared into the void and been granted a last-minute, undeserved reprieve. The greatest triumph of François Villon's life was not a worldly victory, but a solitary act of creation performed in the crucible of his own suffering. Shortly after his release from the prison of Meung-sur-Loire, likely in the winter of 1461, the poet, now 30 years old, sick and penniless, found refuge in a cold Parisian garret and began to write his magnum opus, Le Grand Testament. This was his true and final revenge on the world that had tried to crush him. The work is a masterpiece of staggering originality, a sprawling poem of over 2,000 lines, interspersed with some of his most famous ballades and rondeaux. It is structured as a last will and testament, a mock legal document in which the poet, claiming to be on his deathbed, bequeaths his meager and often imaginary possessions to his friends and, more importantly, to his enemies. This structure allows him to create a sweeping, panoramic portrait of his entire life and the society he inhabited. He settles old scores with savage wit, viciously satirizing the bishop who tortured him, the lover who spurned him, and the authorities who hunted him. He also pays tribute to those who showed him kindness, his more-than-father, Guillaume de Villon, and the various rogues and tavern keepers who formed his dysfunctional family. But the testament is so much more than a personal settling of accounts. It is a profound meditation on the human condition. Villon writes with a shocking, unprecedented realism about the fragility of life, the decay of the body, the bitterness of regret, and the all-consuming fear of death. He seamlessly blends moments of sublime beauty, like the famous Ballad des Dames du temps jadis, with passages of grotesque and scatological humor. He swings wildly from sincere piety to blasphemous rage, from tender nostalgia to bitter cynicism. It was a revolutionary act. In an age of stylized, courtly poetry, Villon ripped the mask off and exposed the raw, contradictory, and often ugly face of humanity. His greatest triumph was to create a work of art not by escaping his miserable reality, but by plunging into its very heart. At the summit of his creative power, as he penned the final lines of his testament, François Villon experienced a unique and profound form of hubris, the hubris of the immortal artist. He was a man who had nothing in the material world. He was poor, sick, and a wanted criminal. Yet, as he wrote, he must have understood that he was forging something that would outlast the stone walls of the Châtelet prison, the wealth of the Collège de Navarre, and the earthly power of the king himself. This was his moment of supreme confidence, a defiant assertion of his own worth in the face of a world that had deemed him worthless. His triumph was not in conquering cities or commanding armies, but in conquering language itself, in bending it to his will to express the totality of his experience. The psychology of this moment is one of audacious revenge. With his quill as his only weapon, he could finally strike back at his tormentors. He could ensure that Bishop Thibaut d'Aussigny would be remembered for eternity, not as a powerful prince of the church, but as the cruel, heartless jailer of a poet. He could mock the sergeants of the watch, the judges, the wealthy hypocrites, trapping them like flies in the amber of his verse. He saw this triumph not as a gift from God, but as something he had seized himself, forged in the fires of his own personal hell. This knowledge gave him a sense of power that no executioner could take away. He openly declares in his work that his rhymes will endure, and this was not mere bravado, it was a deeply held conviction. While other men sought to build legacies of stone or bloodline, Villon built his from the ephemeral, yet eternal, stuff of words. He walked through Paris not as a beaten dog, but as a secret king, the true chronicler of his age, a man who knew that long after the names of his prosecutors were forgotten, students and lovers would still be reciting the Ballad of the Hanged Men. This was the ultimate hubris of the artist, the belief that, through the sheer force of genius, one can achieve a form of godhood, cheating death by creating something that can never die. To understand the depth of Villon's rage and the source of his most profound sense of injustice, we must zoom in on the portrait of his sworn enemy, the man who became the living symbol of all the cruel and arbitrary authority he despised, Thibault d'Aussigny, the Bishop of Orléans. He was not a simple villain. He was a product of his time, a powerful and politically ambitious prelate, a prince of the church who wielded both spiritual and temporal power. He was likely a man of sincere, if severe, piety, who saw it as his duty to maintain order and punish sin within his domain. To a man like d'Aussigny, François Villon was not a misunderstood genius. He was a vagrant, a heretic, a dangerous criminal who represented the chaos and moral decay that threatened the very foundations of Christendom. When Villon was captured in the bishop's territory, d'Aussigny would have felt entirely justified in subjecting him to the full rigor of ecclesiastical law. The personal drama between these two men was a clash of worldviews. On one side was the bishop, representing the rigid, hierarchical order of the medieval world, a world of divine right, established authority, and harsh, unyielding punishment. On the other side was Villon, the embodiment of a new, emerging consciousness, an individualist who respected no authority but his own experience, a man who saw the hypocrisy at the heart of the bishop's power. The chemistry of their conflict was one of pure, unadulterated hatred. For Villon, d'Aussigny was the ultimate hypocrite, a man who preached the mercy of Christ while ordering the torture of his fellow human beings, who lived in a palace, while Villon starved in his pit. The bishop's actions, the imprisonment, the starvation diet, the torture, were not just legal punishments in Villon's eyes. They were personal, sadistic acts of cruelty. In Le Grand Testament, Villon unleashes the full force of his poetic venom on the bishop, sarcastically praying for his soul and wishing him a fate similar to his own. The conflict was deeply personal, a microcosm of the larger war Villon waged against the entire power structure of his society. Thibault d'Aussigny earned his own dark immortality through this encounter. He is remembered by history primarily as the man who tortured François Villon. While kings and nobles of the era undertook grand construction projects of stone and mortar, François Villon's great act of construction, his lasting reform, took place within the intangible realm of language itself. He was a builder who erected a new kind of French poetry. Before Villon, the dominant poetic mode was that of amour courtois, or courtly love. It was a highly stylized, aristocratic art form, filled with allegorical figures, idealized ladies, and noble knights lamenting their unrequited love in meticulously crafted, but often emotionally sterile verses. It was a poetry of the palace, for the palace. Villon shattered this tradition. He took the established forms of the Ballad and the rondeau, forms perfected by poets like his own patron, Charles d'Orléans, and he injected them with a dose of brutal, street-level reality. This was his great reform, the introduction of the personal, the autobiographical, the I into French poetry, with an honesty and rawness that had never been seen before. He did not write about abstract ideals. He wrote about his own hunger, his own fear of the gallows, his own lust, his own remorse. He dragged poetry out of the perfumed gardens of the aristocracy and threw it into the stinking, chaotic, vibrant streets of Paris. He constructed a new poetic vocabulary, incorporating the slang of the coquillards, the jargon of the university, and the crude language of the tavern into his work, creating a rich, polyphonic texture that was both shocking and exhilarating to his contemporaries. His work was a radical act of democratization. He wrote about people who had never before been considered worthy subjects of poetry: prostitutes, thieves, drunkards, and condemned men. He gave a voice to the voiceless. In doing so, he effectively invented a new kind of poetic consciousness, one that was urban, introspective, and deeply engaged with the messy, contradictory realities of human existence. This was his lasting legacy. He tore down the crumbling edifice of medieval poetic convention and, on its ruins, built the foundations of a modern, personal lyricism that would influence French poets for all time. To truly understand the world that Villon immortalized, we must look beyond the grand politics and criminal exploits to the onions and vegetables of his daily existence, particularly the women who populate his verse and embody the warring factions of his own heart. His poetry is a gallery of female portraits, none more central than the two opposing poles of his desire, Catherine de Vaucelles and La Grosse Margot, Fat Margot. Catherine, a noblewoman, likely a relative of the man Villon killed in the brawl that led to his first exile, represents the idealized, unattainable love of the courtly tradition. She is the cruel, disdainful lady who torments her poet-lover. Villon claims she was the cause of a severe beating he received, and his feelings for her are a toxic cocktail of adoration and bitter resentment. She is a ghost, a symbol of a respectable life, and a pure love that he both craved and knew he could never have. At the other extreme is Fat Margot, the prostitute with whom Villon describes a sordid, transactional relationship in one of his most shocking and brilliant ballades. Here, there is no idealization. He depicts their life in the brothel with unblinking, almost brutal honesty. The cheap wine, the arguments over money, the loveless physical coupling. "We are both of us scoundrels," he writes, acknowledging their shared place at the bottom of the social ladder. Margot is as real as Catherine is ethereal. She represents the carnal, the physical, the base reality of his life. These two figures illustrate the profound split in Villon's psyche. He was a man with the education and soul of a poet, capable of imagining the most refined and spiritual love, but his circumstances and appetites constantly dragged him down into the muck. This context, the brothel, the tavern, the unrequited love for a high-born lady, is not mere background. It is the very essence of his work. His genius was to see the poetry in both the princess and the prostitute, to understand that the human heart, in all its sacred and profane dimensions, was the only subject truly worth writing about. After the creative triumph of his testament, a brief period of hope flickered for François Villon. He had survived prison, torture, and the threat of starvation. For a time, he seems to have lived a relatively quiet life, but the fundamental instability of his character and the unforgiving nature of his world soon conspired to bring about the final act of his tragedy. The first cracks in his fragile freedom began to appear as the old patterns reasserted themselves. He was a known criminal, his face and reputation preceding him wherever he went. The doors of respectable society were firmly closed to him. The patronage he may have once enjoyed from nobles like Charles d'Orléans had likely evaporated in the wake of his ever-growing criminal record. He was forced back into the only world that would accept him, the Parisian underworld of thieves, con men, and prostitutes. The cycle began anew. Poverty led to desperation, desperation to crime, and crime to the ever-present threat of arrest. The harbingers of the final storm were not grand conspiracies or political upheavals. They were the small, sordid realities of his life on the margins. He was likely involved in petty thefts, drunken brawls, and the constant, exhausting work of evading the city watch. His luck, which had saved him so miraculously from the bishop's dungeon, was beginning to fray. The authorities, particularly those at the Châtelet, had a long memory. A man like Villon, a master of arts, who had repeatedly embarrassed them with his crimes and his clever evasions, would have been a marked man. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. The relative peace he had known was a false spring, a brief lull before the inevitable tempest. He was a man running out of time, out of patrons, and out of chances, a ghost haunting the edges of a society that was closing in on him from all sides, preparing to deliver the final, decisive blow. The act that triggered François Villon's final, catastrophic downfall was not a grand, audacious crime like the robbery of the Collège de Navarre, but a pointless, stupid, and utterly avoidable street brawl. In November of 1462, Villon was involved in a scuffle in the Rue de la Parcheminerie. It was a messy, chaotic affair involving several of his student and clerk acquaintances and a group associated with a papal notary named Farabuc. Daggers were drawn, as they so often were in the violent streets of Paris, and Farabuc was wounded, though not fatally. Villon, despite likely not being the main instigator, was arrested along with his companions. This was the fateful act, the key decision that sprung the trap. The psychology behind this error is the psychology of a man who was fundamentally self-destructive. After everything he had endured, the exile, the torture, the near starvation, one might expect him to have become cautious, to have learned to walk away from trouble. But Villon's character was defined by a volatile mixture of pride, impulsiveness, and a deep-seated fatalism. He may have felt that, as a known figure in the Latin Quarter, he could not back down from a challenge without losing face. Or perhaps he was simply drunk, his judgment clouded by cheap wine and the accumulated bitterness of his life. He likely made the decision to join the fray in a split second, driven by instinct and the ingrained habits of a life lived by the code of the street rather than the rule of law. He fatally underestimated his position. He was no longer just another rowdy student. He was François Villon, a notorious thief and jailbird with a royal pardon already to his name. For the authorities at the Châtelet, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The Farabuc affair, in itself a minor incident, was the pretext they needed to rid themselves of this troublesome poet, once and for all. It was the final, foolish miscalculation of a man who had gambled with his life one too many times. The affaire Farabuc was the key that locked the final door. Villon was arrested and thrown back into the familiar, dreaded dungeons of the Châtelet. This time, there would be no powerful patron to intervene, no convenient royal amnesty to save him. The authorities decided to make an example of him. They put him to the water torture to extract a full confession, not just about the brawl, but about all his past crimes. Broken and terrified, Villon confessed everything. The greatest catastrophe of his life, the moment his lifelong obsession with death became an immediate, bureaucratic reality, arrived shortly thereafter. The Provost of Paris reviewed his case, taking into account his entire criminal history, including the old robbery of the Collège de Navarre. The verdict was absolute and merciless. François Villon, Master of Arts, was sentenced to be hanged. This was the abyss he had written about, the ultimate horror he had both feared and courted his entire life. The sentence triggered the composition of his most chilling and poignant poem, L'Épitaphe Villon, better known as the Ballad des Pendus, Ballad of the Hanged Men. In it, he imagines his own body and those of his companions swinging from the gallows, pecked by birds, washed by rain, and burned by the sun. He gives a voice to the dead, pleading with the living who pass by to pray for their souls. It is a work of breathtaking empathy and terrifying immediacy, a final, desperate artistic act from a man who believed he had only days to live. The moral and psychological catastrophe was complete. He was no longer a defiant rogue playing a game with the law. He was a condemned man, stripped of all agency, waiting for the executioner's cart. The poet who had spent his life meditating on death was now forced to confront its mundane, terrifying reality head-on. The period following the death sentence was a frantic, desperate scramble for survival, a last-ditch effort to pull back from the very edge of the abyss. From his cell in the Châtelet, or perhaps the Conciergerie, Villon and his legal counsel launched an appeal to the highest court in the kingdom, the Parlement of Paris. This was his final, desperate gamble. The psychological state of a man in such a position is almost impossible to fathom. A daily existence suspended between the faintest glimmer of hope and the overwhelming certainty of a brutal, public death. Every creak of a door, every footstep in the hall, could signal the arrival of the executioner. The collapse of his world was total. He was abandoned by most of his friends, a pariah whose fate was now in the hands of the very bewigged magistrates he had so often mocked in his verses. Yet, in a final, stunning twist of fortune, his appeal was successful. On the 5th of January, 1463, the Parlement of Paris issued its ruling. It acknowledged Villon's intelligence and talent, but also his wasted life and incorrigible nature. They decided to commute the death sentence. It was a moment of miraculous reprieve, but the salvation offered was a bitter one. Instead of being hanged, François Villon's sentence was reduced to 10 years of banishment from the city of Paris and its environs. This was the last chance, a chance to live. But for Villon, it was also a form of death. Paris was not just his home, it was his muse, his subject, the source of his entire artistic identity. To be banished from Paris was to be silenced, to be cut off from the very wellspring of his genius. He was being saved from the gallows, only to be cast into a wilderness of anonymity. It was a cruel, ironic mercy, a final joke played by the fate that had toyed with him his entire life. The broken hero was granted his life, but stripped of his world. The finale of François Villon's recorded life is not a dramatic death scene or a final great act, but a quiet, enigmatic disappearance. Sometime in early 1463, shortly after the Parlement commuted his death sentence, the gates of his Parisian prison swung open one last time. He walked out, a free man, into the cold winter air. He was 31 years old, his health likely shattered, his spirit battered, with nothing to his name but the clothes on his back and the immortal verses stored in his memory. Under the terms of his sentence, he had to leave his beloved city for a decade. He turned his back on the spires of Notre Dame, the bustling lecture halls of the Sorbonne, the smoky taverns, the fetid alleys, and the towering gallows of Montfaucon, the entire landscape of his soul, and he began to walk. And at that moment, François Villon, the man of flesh and blood, vanishes from the historical record forever. There are no more court documents, no more chronicles, no more records of arrest. There is only silence. Did he die of sickness in a ditch a few weeks later? Did he find his way to another patron's court and live out his days in obscurity? Did he join a band of mercenaries or return to a life of crime in some provincial town, eventually meeting a violent end? We will never know. This utter lack of a conclusion is, perhaps, the most fitting end to his story. He lived his life as a transient, a ghost haunting the margins of society, and his final act was to transform into a literal ghost, a phantom who simply faded away. His finale was not an execution, but an evaporation. He left the stage, leaving behind only his work, a literary last will and testament that would grant him the one thing he always craved and could never find in his chaotic life: permanence. The man walked into the mist, but the poet stepped into eternity. Villon's disappearance from history was the catalyst for his birth into legend. His legacy immediately became a battleground for competing interpretations, a conflict that has raged for over 500 years. In the decades following his death, his work was among the very first to be published by the new technology of the printing press, a testament to his immediate and widespread popularity. For his contemporaries and the poets who followed, like Clément Marot, he was a master craftsman, a brilliant, if roguish, technician of verse. But as the centuries passed, his image began to shift and transform. The greatest act of reinvention came in the 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism. The Romantics, with their love for the misunderstood, rebellious genius, saw in Villon the perfect archetype of the poète maudit, the cursed poet. They seized upon the story of the thief scholar and transformed him into a bohemian hero, a proto-romantic rebel shaking his fist at a staid and hypocritical society. He became a symbol of artistic freedom, his crimes reinterpreted as acts of rebellion, his poverty a badge of honor. This romanticized image of Villon the swashbuckling vagabond has proven incredibly durable, influencing everything from novels and operas to Hollywood films. In the 20th century, however, scholars began to push back against this mythologizing. Armed with the rediscovered court records of his crimes, they painted a different, darker portrait. Villon the hardened criminal, the unrepentant thug, a man whose associations with the murderous Coquillards were not a romantic gesture, but a deadly reality. For these scholars, to ignore his criminality was to sanitize the man and misunderstand the brutal world that produced his poetry. Today, the conflict continues. Was he a conscious artist, carefully crafting a rebellious persona, or a desperate man simply chronicling his own miserable life? Was he a victim of a cruel and unjust society, or the author of his own destruction? The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in the complex, shadowy space between these extremes. He was both, and that is precisely why he remains an object of endless fascination. We are now brought back to the core question, the central dramatic paradox. How did this poet-thief, this scholar of the streets, become the immortal voice of the French soul? The final, comprehensive answer is that he achieved this not in spite of his life as a criminal and an outcast, but precisely because of it. The courtly poets of his time wrote from a position of comfort and privilege. Theirs was a world of polished surfaces, of intricate rules and idealized emotions. They were singing from within the castle walls. François Villon sang from the pit. His criminality and his constant proximity to death gave him a perspective of radical authenticity. He had no reputation to protect, no noble patron to flatter. This position of utter marginalization freed him to write the unvarnished truth as he saw it. The prison cell was not just a place of punishment. It was his crucible, the space where all illusions were burned away. In the dungeon of Meung-sur-Loire, he could not afford the luxury of allegory or artifice. He was left with only the stark, elemental realities of the human condition: pain, fear, regret, lust, and the desperate, flickering hope for salvation. His voice became the voice of France because it was the voice of the excluded, the voice of everyone who felt the chill of poverty, the sting of injustice, and the terror of oblivion. He spoke for the students, the soldiers, the prostitutes, the thieves, and the condemned, the vast, silent majority of the medieval population whose lives were never recorded in the official chronicles. By giving voice to his own specific, suffering self, he paradoxically gave voice to a universal humanity. He proved that the most profound truths are often found at the bottom of society, not the top. He is the soul of France because he embodies its deepest contradictions, its love of intellectualism and its earthy carnality, its piety and its cynicism, its elegance and its violence. The thief was essential to the poet. The sinner was essential to the saint. One could not exist without the other. What, then, is the universal lesson of this chaotic, brilliant, and tragic life? What is the final verdict of history on François Villon? His saga is a testament to one of the most powerful and unsettling truths about human creativity: that great art is not born from comfort, but from friction. It is forged in the clash between the aspirations of the spirit and the brutal limitations of the flesh, between the quest for beauty and the reality of suffering. Villon's life demonstrates that the human voice is an instrument of astonishing resilience, capable of producing its most beautiful music under the most extreme pressure. He teaches us that authenticity is the scarcest and most valuable currency in art, and that it is often paid for with a life of pain and alienation. His story is a profound commentary on the price of power and the nature of immortality. The bishops, judges, and kings who held the power of life and death over him are now mere footnotes in his story. They sought to preserve their power in stone, in laws, and in titles. Villon, with nothing but his wit and his anger, secured a more lasting kingdom in the hearts and minds of future generations. He represents the ultimate victory of the individual voice over the silencing force of institutions. His life is a testament to the idea that no prison can truly hold the human spirit, and no death sentence can extinguish a voice that has something true and essential to say. The ultimate lesson of François Villon is that beauty is not a delicate flower to be cultivated in a protected garden. It is a stubborn, hardy weed that can force its way through the cracks in the pavement, a testament to the irrepressible force of life in the darkest and most forsaken corners of the world. And so, we are left with the final frame, the lasting, indelible image that encapsulates the entire saga. It is not the image of a man hanging from a gallows, nor that of a scholar bent over a dusty manuscript. It is the image of his final act, a set of footprints in the winter snow leading away from the gates of Paris. The footprints are sharp and clear at first, the tracks of a solitary figure walking into exile. But as they move toward the horizon, into the vast, indifferent emptiness of the French countryside, they grow fainter, less distinct. The falling snow begins to soften their edges, to blur their definition. Finally, they disappear altogether, swallowed by the white, silent landscape. The man is gone, erased from the physical world as completely as the snows of yesteryear. But what remains, hanging in the cold air, echoing back across the centuries from the city he left behind, is his voice. It is there in the ballads sung in taverns, in the books stacked in libraries, in the minds of lovers and rebels who still find their own reflection in his defiant, desperate, and beautiful words. The flesh vanishes, the footprints are covered, but the ink remains. The final delicious irony of François Villon's Kebab is this: by being banished, by disappearing, by becoming nothing, he became everything. He became a ghost, a myth, a voice, and therefore he became eternal.